My name is Jessica Wiederhorn. I'm an oral historian. I'm the co-founder of the Narrative Trust, and I have been asked by Dr. James Edward Cottrell to participate with him in his oral history. He's been invited to give his oral history for the Living History of Anesthesiology. Today is May 21st, 2010, and we are in New York City, in the home of Dr. Cottrell. Let's talk about the path that took you to where you are today.
I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and it was very small. We had about, I guess, 1,000 people, if that. And so it was an interesting time for me, and going to school, and I found that I was not challenged very much with my schools. And so I was able to excel and be at the top of my class, and that I think that continued until I got to medical school. And for the first time, I was really challenged in terms of being able to, learn information and repeat information and think abstractly. So medical school was a big challenge for me, and something terrific.
Yeah, but I do know that there was at least one figure in your hometown who was a role model for you, and who, may have had something to do with leading you to medical school. Yeah. So let's talk about him for a minute, because that's important, I think.
Well, I think early on, the people that were admired the most in our community, and also by myself, were the teachers, our teachers in the schools, the public schools, and then our family physician. It seemed as if our family physician was the one that was the most respected, and people really deferred to on not just medical matters, but a lot of other advice that he would give as well.
What was his name?
His name was Arthur Lampton, and actually I had the opportunity to work with him at a small hospital not far from our house. And so I was sort of like an aide to physical therapy. And so I would bring patients back and forth to therapy, and he was their physician. And so I got to see, what he really did and how he made people feel comfortable, and a variety of things.
How old were you when you did that?
I was 15. I was 15. That was my first experience.
What about college? Where did you go to college?
Well, college, I went to a college which was it was in Charleston, which was the big city from where I grew up. And I went to a small college called Morris Harvey College. And I was able to get a journalism scholarship because I could write, and I was interested in the news as well. And they really didn't have pre-med scholarships, and they didn't have biology scholarships. So I looked around and found this journalism scholarship, and so for the first 3 years of college, I was a journalism major. And then I had to switch, of course, in my 4th year, and because I had to get all my pre-med requirements in. And so I had to take a full-time job because I no longer had my scholarship. So I worked full-time and finished my college that year, and did quite well, and then went to medical school.
Mm-hmm. And where did you go to medical school?
Well, I went to West Virginia University. There were a lot of reasons why I went to WVU. The main reason was cost, because it was very inexpensive. I had a wonderful uncle who was interested in me after my father died. My father died when I was 10 years old. And so his brother then took an interest in me and sort of would call me and ask me to meet him for lunch or a variety of other places. And so actually during the last year of college, he's the one who was able to get this job for me at a research center. And it was Union Carbide's research center. And so I was able to work on rocket fuel, and we were trying to to devise a solid rocket fuel that would burn as fast as liquid rocket fuel. So even that was very interesting. But anyhow, his brother was the head of this Center for Research, so he was able to arrange for me to have this position.
And what was his name?
Finley Cottrell.
And that's how it was pronounced? Cottrell?
Cottrell, that's how it was pronounced.
When you were in medical school, what did you think you would do after medical school? Did you have a sense then?
Well, when I was in medical school, I somehow got interested in surgery. And so in my senior year, then I decided to do my first post-medical school year in surgery. And so I was set to be probably a general surgeon at the time. And it was during that year that I changed my, my outlook and decided to be an anesthesiologist. And it was a wonderful story. When you're a surgery resident, or when you were a surgery resident in those days, you would do a lot of scut work. So you would do histories and physicals, and you'd hold retractors all day, and you'd work all night, and sometimes you'd work 36 hours and you're off 8 hours. And so it didn't leave a lot of room for thought or social life or anything. But one day we were operating on a patient that was fairly sick, and the patient had a cardiac arrest. And so the surgeon, the attending surgeon that I was with, backed up against the wall, and the anesthesiologist took over. And they came from everywhere. They came from a variety of rooms, and within a few minutes they had the heart beating again, the blood pressure stable, and the surgeon looked really relieved and said, "Can we go ahead?" And so I decided, gee, that looks really interesting. Looks really, really interesting. And I kept thinking about it. And we had a month's elective while we were on surgery. So I decided I would do a month on anesthesiology. And it was really very, very interesting for me. And I think the thing that really did it is one day I was sitting in the anesthesia office, and one of the nurses came by, a nurse anesthetist at the time, and asked if I would like to go with her for a delivery. And so we went upstairs, and we were greeted by a very obese lady who was having a baby. And so the nurse proceeded to give the patient anesthesia and had a really bad complication. And the patient actually didn't do well. And so I said, my goodness, this is something that's really interesting, and they really need me. So you know, I should consider this as my future career. And so that was sort of the way it started, and I didn't look back. I switched the next year to anesthesiology from surgery. That was when I was at Allegheny General Hospital. And then after that, I went to Mercy Hospital to study anesthesiology. And I did that for the main reason was that the chairman of anesthesiology at the time was someone who was cutting edge and doing research in a variety of areas. And he had a real commitment to research and progress in anesthesiology.
What's his name?
His name was Rick Syker. And he was just a role model for all of us at the time. And he not only was a scientist, but he also became president of the American Society of Anesthesiologists early on in the 70s. And so he continued to be a role model for me for a very long time.
Well, you had said to me off camera that your first research project was there at Pitt in Pittsburgh.
Yes.
And was that under his
actually
tutelage?
Yes, he was the chairman, and he had a research director, Bernard Wolfson, and he was just a wonderful guy who was very funny and very smart. And so I started to work with him on a number of projects and decided I really was interested in research and finding out why things worked, or why we did certain things, or which things we should do differently. It was really a basis for what we were doing scientifically. So I got very interested in practical solutions and practical experiments to look to see cause and effect. And then at the time, there wasn't fellowship positions, but I decided I'd like to do a research fellowship. So I took an extra year and I did a research fellowship with a guy from University of Pittsburgh, Gene Robbins, and really studied the effects of anesthetics on the respiratory system. And so from that fellowship I had approximately two publications as a resident. So it was really quite wonderful for me, and I just became totally interested in academic medicine.
You know, you said to me before, I wasn't so interested in rats then. And so was that with rats or without rats? I mean, what did you mean by that?
Well, this is basically these were human studies.
Okay.
And so it was good for me to work with humans. And actually I did that even during my career at NYU. And it wasn't until I went to Downstate that I started to be interested in basic science research. For much the same reason, you know, what is the basis for our beliefs? And also it was, as time passed, it was easier to do laboratory research because all you needed to do was get grants and you didn't have to get permission from patients. So as time passed, it became more difficult to get permission from patients for research projects.
You know, when we spoke before, you talked to me a little bit, because I'm not a colleague of yours in your field, so you were speaking to me about a little bit about the history of anesthesiology and neuroanesthesiology, and I think I'd like to just talk about that for a minute before we move on, because I think that's relevant to what you're saying now about your own life, about what it was like.
Right.
When you first began.
When I decided to go into anesthesiology, there were very few anesthesiologists. In fact, in those days, in the 60s, I can't believe it's in the 60s, but in the 60s there were very few anesthesiologists, and most of the anesthetics were given by nurses, nurse anesthetist or a nurse that had some experience with giving anesthesia. So it was, you know, it was a specialty that was really in need of more medical input and medical direction. And so we had about 6,000 when I went into anesthesia in the whole country. And now we have somewhere around 45,000 anesthesiologists. So the specialty's really grown and achieved a lot of credibility.
And also the place of anesthesiology in terms of the respect that the field has. You talked to me about that and how much that has changed, and what it used to be like in the old days. Why don't you mention that?
Well, you know, I think in the old days, since the surgeons were working with nurses, in the hierarchy of things, they had the absolute say, and they were considered captain of the ship. So they would often dictate, you know, which drugs were given, which monitors were used, and a variety of things. So when a physician, another physician, would come into the room to work with them as an equal, it was very difficult to have that transition. And it must have taken 20 years from the time I started. I remember my early days at NYU even, and this was in the early 70s. I showed up one morning very early. We had a very sick patient who was having carotid surgery on the neck. And I had gotten there early and I'd placed these monitors and I had the patient all ready to go. And the surgeon walked into the room and pulled the monitors out of the patient and off the patient and said, "Don't you ever touch my patients without my permission." And so, so I couldn't leave the room, but anyhow, it was an interesting time. And it took us about, you know, it took a generational change. Because the surgeons, you know, like the role models, the chairs of surgery, would train their underlings the same way. So once we started to establish that we were peers and that our information was as important as the technical skill of the surgeon, then I think now we're part of a team and it works much better.
You know, and you also, in that same conversation, talked to me about the importance of numbers of anesthesiologists and why, because there are so many more, the subspecialties could grow.
Right.
So,
you know, I think that early on, when I first went into anesthesiology, I was really interested in the quality of care. And so I would spend a lot of my time and weekends going to conferences to educate nurse anesthetists, because they were giving most of the anesthetics. So I thought, we really have to train everyone who's giving anesthesia so that there'll be fewer complications and the outcomes will be better for the patients. So then we started, as we became peers with the surgeon and had credibility, then we started to recruit medical students into anesthesiology. And I think that was one of my major goals, not only to improve the quality of care in anesthesia, but also to recruit medical students so we would have more physicians in anesthesia. And so in fact, that's one of the things I did when I became chair at Downstate. I negotiated with the then dean that we would have a mandatory medical student rotation so they could see what the anesthesiologist does. And in fact, it's worked. We now recruit 10 to 12% of the class into anesthesia. And throughout the country, it's usually 5% or 4%.
So anesthesia is not a mandatory rotation everywhere?
No, very few medical schools at the time had a mandatory rotation. But I think with the implementation at our place and some other medical schools, and other people said, well, maybe this is the way we can really build physician anesthesia. And in fact, that's what's happened. I think about 40–50% of schools now have a mandatory rotation. But in those days, it was very few.
I'm amazed it's not 100%. And what about, with these numbers now of, anesthesiologists? I was going to say general anesthesiologists, but that's probably, you can't say that. But neuro anesthesia became a subspecialty, and there are others as well.
Yes, when we started to get enough anesthesiologists to provide safe care for the patients, then we could think about subspecialization. And surgery was becoming more complex and more complicated, so there was a great need for subspecialists in anesthesiology. And so I happened to have gotten interested in neuroanesthesiology when I was in the Navy, and that was just one of the subspecialties. So that developed quite nicely over the years. We have cardiac anesthesiology, critical care anesthesiology, pain medicine anesthesiology. So there's a variety of subspecialties now, and even some that have special boards in the subspecialty. So it's been wonderful to see that development as well.
Well, that leads very beautifully back to your life and the fact that you were drafted into the Navy.
Right.
And the Vietnam War was happening at the time.
Right.
And so where did you go?
Well, I think 1967 or 68, I received my draft notice, and even though I was in medical school. But once they found out that I was in medical school, then I got a deferment, and until I finished medical school. But then once I decided to go into anesthesiology, it was a specialty that was sought after because there were very few. So then they decided that they should defer me until I finished my anesthesiology residency, and so they did. And then in 1972, I went. I had to go and serve 2 years in the Navy. By that time, as you know, the Vietnamese War was winding down, and so I was sent to Iceland. It was my first year, and I served not only as an anesthesiologist, but also served as a general medical officer. And we had about 5,000 dependents that we took care of on base. So there was a surgeon, an anesthesiologist, and an obstetrician, and we all filled in for general medical duties. And then after that year, I was transferred to Philadelphia, to the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. When I was in Philadelphia, there was a neurosurgeon that people had difficulty working with, and he had to have special attention. So the chief at the Naval Hospital decided that I should always work with this neurosurgeon. And if he were particularly difficult that day, that perhaps we shouldn't operate, and I should find a reason to cancel the case. So I worked with him for a year, and not only did I have my role in monitoring the neurosurgeon, but I actually became interested in neuroanesthesiology. And it was such an exciting area, working on the brain and the spinal cord and thinking about things that you could study and do in terms of improving care for those particular patients.
Well, and were you thinking at that time that this is what you would pursue?
You know, actually it was so interesting, I didn't think of doing anything else while I was in the Navy. And that's what I did. I even, you know, when I took call, they gave me special calls for neuro in case there were trauma cases or something that came in. And I didn't really think about it until I started to look for positions in medical schools for when I finished the Navy. And I interviewed at a lot of places in those days. And I settled on 3 different medical schools. One was University of California at San Francisco. And there was a very, you know, the chairman there was very encouraging of young people and research and academic excellence. His name was Bill Hamilton. So he was trying to recruit me. The other was at Emory University. And John Steinhaus was there, and he also was the same kind of person. So by this time there were a few role models in medical schools for anesthesiology. And then NYU was headed by Herman Turndorf, who had recently, at the time, just been the chairman at West Virginia University. So while he was at West Virginia University, he knew I was from West Virginia. And he was always writing me, and he would come to my talks when I was doing those research talks. And so when he went to NYU, he called me and wanted me to come and consider NYU for my career. So it came down to those 3 places, Emory, NYU, and UC San Francisco. And so then at that point, I decided that I would go with the one that offered me the best opportunities for research and also for money. And then I think somewhere back in my mind I knew that I was gay and probably San Francisco or New York would be the better of the choices. So with that in mind, it sort of came down to UC San Francisco and NYU. And I decided on NYU because he gave me more money. I think he promised me $55,000 a year, which was a lot of money in those days.
It was, and that's how we met, because you were in New York, so that was perfect. It was with him also that you wrote your first textbook.
Right. Well, NYU was just probably the best choice I could have ever made. Not only did I have Herman, but Turndorf, the chairman of anesthesia, but he actually gave me a lot of freedom. And I was able to, and he asked if I would head the section on neuroanesthesia, because they had a very famous neurosurgical group there. Joe Ransohoff, Fred Epstein, Eugene Flamm. So one was a pediatric neurosurgeon, one was a vascular neurosurgeon, Joe was a tumor neurosurgeon. And then we had a chairman of neurology, Bill Haas, and he was quite incredible in terms of his ability to get grant money from NIH and a variety of other sources. So I was able then to go and do research, not only with anesthesia, but also with neurosurgery and with neurology. And we even had internists that work with us to do our research. So it was a real collaborative team. And so while I was at NYU, I got something like 26 papers published. And Herman gave me the time to sort of spearhead those papers when the other people didn't have as much time to write the grants or to write the papers and those sorts of things. So it was just a great opportunity.
Was that, would you say, unusual, that kind of collaboration between the anesthesiologists and the other doctors?
Well, as I said, it was very difficult to form relationships, particularly with surgeons. So that's why I was so surprised that the neurosurgeons there welcomed me with open arms. And they were really interested in advancing the specialty. And so it was just such a treat, you know, not to have them yank my monitors out of the patients and tell me what to do, but to actually have them ask me, what should we do? So it was really quite, I mean, I was spoiled.
It's a great way to be spoiled.
Yeah.
So, so you wrote this textbook. This was entitled?
Yes. At the time it was called Cottrell and Turndorf's Neuroanesthesia. And so at the time, the subspecialty was in development, and the information about management of patients for neurosurgical procedures was just blossoming. And so there were a lot of people now who were having to do neuroanesthesia, and we'd advanced in a variety of areas. So we wanted to transmit that information to everyone in the country and also in other countries. And so I decided that I would write this book, or edit this book, and so it would achieve wide recognition and readership in other countries. Then I invited people from other countries to help me prepare this book. And so it was finally published in 1980, and it became the textbook in this subject. And now it's in its 5th edition, and I have a young new co-editor with me, Bill Young, from University of California at San Francisco. So the circle comes around. And it's still a very popular book, and I think it's the only book in this area at the time. So
And it's still the major textbook.
it's still, yes.
And something else was brewing at the time, and that was the journal.
Yes. Well, as I said, the information about management and research in this particular area was blossoming. And so if you wanted to find research advancements or articles that had been published, you'd have to go through all these journals. So you'd have to go through all the general anesthesia journals. So you'd have to go through Anesthesiology, the British Journal, the Canadian Journal, to try to find articles that were relevant for neuroanesthesia. So I decided, why don't we, have a journal that's devoted to this subject, and then you'll have one source that you can use for information, and it should be an international source. So I asked John Hartung, someone I work with, who's familiar with this area, and we started this journal. It's called the Blue Journal on Neurosurgical Anesthesiology. And again, the collaboration is international. And we have 9 societies represented with the journal. And these 9 societies then, members of their societies, submit their research for publication. And so it's just been, I think, an incredible help for all of us caring for these patients. And it's really advanced the science and the outcomes of our patients. And if you look at the editorial board, it's, people are from all over the country. It's just like a who's who from other countries. And we represent Japan and Great Britain and China. And so the information is really, really helpful to anyone who practices neuroanesthesia. And it's also, the thing that we never thought would happen is there are 22 journals in anesthesiology. And our journal is ranked number 6 or 7 most of the time by the Science Citation Index, which means it's cited very frequently by other people in their research. So it's pretty good for a subspecialty journal and 22 other journals. So very proud of that.
As one should be.
Yeah.
So eventually you did leave NYU, and how did that happen?
Well, as I said, at the time I was doing collaborative research with all those people. Not to brag, but I got published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Neuroscience, a variety of really good journals. And by that time, since there still were few anesthesiologists, and certainly anesthesiologists who had published around, I started to get telephone calls from medical schools and universities to see if I might be interested in chairing their department. And this was quite flattering. I was only 36 years old. And so I looked at a number inside New York and outside New York. Actually, I did look at 2 inside New York. The chairs in anesthesia in New York don't come up very often because people stay long periods of time. But so I looked at Albany Medical Center, which was available, and I looked at Downstate. And I really loved Downstate. And again, I knew I couldn't leave New York because of my personal life. And by this time, I had a partner, Joe. And so I wanted to stay in New York. And Downstate was very exciting because it was a a very diverse medical school. And the medical students seemed to be different. They were more interested in the experience with patients than in the ability to be competitive academically. And somehow, even though they were interested in the experience with patients, they did achieve academic excellence. So it was just, I thought it was a real opportunity. And not only that, Downstate, again, you know, it was like anesthesiology in the 60s needed me because they had lost their chair, and they'd only had 2 chairs at Downstate. The first one, who founded the department, is just a wonderful guy, Merrill Harmel, and he founded 3 departments of anesthesia. He founded our department in 1952, and he's alive, and he is 92 years old, and this year we've gotten him an honorary degree from SUNY. So he's coming to our graduation, and I'm very proud that he's going to be the first anesthesiologist that's gotten an honorary degree from SUNY. So it's really great. So anyhow, it was ripe. So if I went there, you know, and didn't succeed, I could say, well, you know, there wasn't much to work with. But if I succeeded, you know, the upside was great because we had all those patients to provide care for, and just a wonderful opportunity, I think, to improve care and research and a variety of things.
Well, and I mean, I know because I live in New York that this is, the patients at this hospital are mostly poor people and you know, in quite bad shape. So
right.
Would you just talk about that as part of the challenge, I think?
Well, you know, the patient population is certainly one of the pluses, because you really feel as if you're doing something for patients because they need medical care so badly. We have a variety of opportunities, though. We have University Hospital, which has probably the sickest patients around. They're all classified as ASA 3s and 4s, which means they have a lot of comorbidities. So these are very sick patients when we get them, and so it's very difficult to care for them, so you really need to be cutting edge and know your stuff. So it's a great teaching opportunity for us. We also have Kings County Hospital, which is across the street, which is the largest city hospital, and it's a level 1 trauma center. So we get a lot of patients through the emergency room who've been shot or stabbed or hit in the head with a baseball bat. So again, a big opportunity for us to contribute to patients and also to teach and to have good learning experiences.
So what were some of the things that you did when you first got there?
Well, it really was a challenge. So we had 4 areas to work on. One would be the educational part of the program, because for residency training and for the medical students, you had to have an excellent program in education. We had to look at research, so we had to start to try and develop research. And in clinical care, I mean, just to be able to provide clinical care was a huge challenge. So right away we had to start to recruit. So I started to recruit, first of all, enough people that were good and that we could provide clinical service. And then after we got the clinical service, then I decided that we needed to recruit our educational vice chair. So we recruited somebody who was really good in education. And I'll never forget the first class that graduated, where we got 4 downstate students to come into anesthesiology. Just made my day. I mean, I was so pleased because students from downstate didn't train in anesthesiology there. And so we got 4, and then from then on we've always been able to get a large number of students from downstate.
Was that partially because of the required rotation?
I think it is. Statistically, if you look at programs across the country, there seems to be no relationship. But I think at our place, there's a big relationship. And from that time on, we've gotten so many students into anesthesiology.
So recruitment was a big job in the beginning, it sounds like. Yeah.
Recruitment was huge. And also, we didn't have a lot of money. You know, it was a state institution. We did have hard money, so there were some faculty salaries for teaching and for administration and things like that. But I knew right away that I had to have a way to get additional revenue into the department in order for us to be successful. So as we built our clinical excellence, then surrounding hospitals in the area started to look to Downstate's anesthesia department for advice and support. And so probably one of the best things that ever happened was when the CEO of Long Island College Hospital asked us if we'd be interested in providing anesthesia services. And he was willing to give us a contract, which was very lucrative for us. And so now we had the clinical excellence, and now we were able to have some financial support that we could use for basic research development, educational programs, that sort of thing. And so it sort of all started to come together. And
there was a number that I read just in something that you gave me, the numbers of the students that you had then and that you have now.
When I first went to Downstate, we had 7 residents in the program. And now we have approximately 70 residents in our training program, which is, you know, a big expansion. And, you know, it's not only, I think at the time it was mainly the 7 did a lot of clinical service, but now, you know, we have residents in all the subspecialties, we have residents training outside, we have residents training in echocardiography. So it's just a wonderful academic experience for our residents.
And what about the kinds of research you were doing?
Well, when I left NYU, as I said, I was doing mainly neurosurgical research that related to patients. And so there I studied things like, very basic things like the effects of certain vasodilators on the brain and cerebral blood flow. And I was able to document that these were bad for patients with raised intracranial pressure. So it sort of changed the way people treated patients with raised intracranial pressure. We also looked at mannitol, which is a diuretic that decreases brain volume. But we found that if you give large doses, it can cause damage to the brain. So it sort of changed the way that was handled as well. And then I became interested in nitrous oxide and felt that it had some detrimental effects on the brain, and particularly patients with problems, with neuronal problems, brain cell death, and that sort of thing. And so we did a lot of research on that and found that in fact it did. So now very few people use nitrous oxide. And then there was a common muscle relaxant that we used that causes a lot of twitching and stuff before paralysis occurs. So I thought that can't be good for a brain, that's borderline. And so from those studies then, now I think almost no one uses that drug either. We also, at the time, this vasodilator that I talked about was nitroprusside. And you couldn't use it for very long because the breakdown product was cyanide. And so I was reading somewhere that vitamin B12 would combine with the cyanide, and then it could be excreted in the urine. And so we tested that in humans, and actually that's what was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it was a way to treat cyanide poisoning. But then we stopped using the drug in those patients, so it wasn't a big deal.
You know, when I was doing the research for this interview, I asked you to give me the names of some people I might talk to or get emails from who could talk about your career. So I was getting information from a variety of sources, and I got the most amazing emails from people. And one of the themes from almost all of them was the encouragement and support you gave to young people in the field. And I'd like you to talk about the importance of teaching to you and of supporting these young people in the ways that you have over your entire career, even when you yourself were quite young.
Right.
So what does it mean to you, and why did you do it?
Well, I found early on that what you needed to do is find young people who are smarter than you are, and people who had ideas, and people who had the capability of conducting research and actually advancing the specialty. So I would always look for these young people who were presenting papers, maybe their first paper or second paper. And I would remember back to my early days when I was so excited about my first research projects. So if I found someone that I felt was impressive, then I would try to sort of court that person and try to help them develop even more, give them advice, even offer them positions in our laboratory to work in research. And I think I've had 14 different fellows, maybe, no, actually more than that. It's like, I can't remember, but I think it's 24, 25 now. And so those fellows would come and work in the lab and then go back to their institutions and do research, or go to another country and do research. And then they became resources for me because they developed in other areas, areas that I was not aware of. So then, like for the journal or for the book, then I would have these consultants who could help me in a variety of areas. So they actually grew to be able to be resource people for our subspecialty and for me to advance it.
And some of these people came from all corners of the world.
Yes.
So, I mean, was that something that you consciously sought to do?
You know, I think I was really lucky because once the book was published and once I started doing research and having it published on an international level, then I would be invited to come to a variety of medical schools in other countries. And when I would go to those medical schools, I would always ask to go to the lab or to see what research people were doing. And then I would find someone, and I would find someone who was brilliant. And then, of course, I would try to form a relationship with that person and encourage them. And it really did work. I mean, when it came time to develop the journal, by that time I'd had sort of an international experience. And so with the journal then, I could invite people from other countries to help with the formation. And I think then, now the journal has 9 international societies as societies that are represented by the journal. So it's really nice to see Japanese colleagues and German and Portuguese and Chinese, and so it's just so many countries that are represented now. So I really have enjoyed that.
One of the people wrote that you are the paradigm case of how scholarship is in a subspecialty forms the basis of achieving great things.
Oh.
Really pointing to this scholarship and the subspecialty, the contribution of the subspecialty. You think that's true?
Oh, it's very kind. Very kind.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of kindness about you. I mean, this is the same person who said, you know, neuroanesthesia is now a bona fide subspecialty. So, I mean, was there a struggle to get the journal to make it a bona fide subspecialty? What were the challenges to making that happen?
You know, I think early on, when there were a few of us who were trying to develop neuroanesthesia into a subspecialty. I had started to be a member of some committees for our national organization, the American Society of Anesthesiologists. And they also was very diverse and not structured in terms of subspecialties, so it was very hard to find information. You'd have to go through all the meetings and all the booklets and everything to find out what was happening in neuroanesthesia. So I started then to lobby and try to convince the National Society that we needed a voice. And so I did achieve having a subspecialty representation to our National Society's House of Delegates, and actually was that first delegate. And so since then now, I think all of the subspecialties have a delegate. It's not just one that represented all of them, but now each one has a delegate. So it was an interesting struggle because they were so protective that it was the American Society of Anesthesiologists, not the American Society of Neuroanesthesiology or Cardiac Anesthesiology. So there was a big fear that there would be splinter groups that would, you know, create problems for the National Society. But it didn't happen. You know, we've all stayed loyal to to the American Society, but we are subspecialties in that and represent it quite well.
And so, I don't know if you mentioned the year that the first edition of the journal came out.
Yes, in 1989 was the first one.
Right. So you were the founder and remain editor-in-chief.
Correct. And I think, you know, I think no one's scrambling, well, someone may be, but no one's scrambling to replace me, since we're 6th or 7th in terms of ranking for all the journals. And myself and John Hartung, I think, are really enthusiastic about continuing to achieve excellence with the journal.
I think it's going to be time to really talk about the American Society of Anesthesiologists.
Okay, I think before we go on, though, I just wanted to talk about the first volume 1 of the Journal of Neurosurgical Anesthesiology. And this came out in March of 1989. And if you look at the editorial board, you can see that these were experts from all over the country and also from other countries. So, and it had not only anesthesiologists but neurosurgeons, which I felt was very important to include in our discussions and in our publications for the journal. So that was the beginning in March of 1989.
So, you know, once all of that was happening and your department was financially in order, the recruits were coming, I mean, things were sort of falling in place, but you continued to be a manager and an administrator, you told me that you took some courses. I mean, there was a lot of, you know, trial by fire, right. But that you felt that was important in the department. And could you talk about that aspect of running a department? You know,
I think I became interested in administration along with my research and teaching activities when I was a resident. I was asked to be chief resident. So as chief resident, you know, you had a lot of administrative responsibilities for the other residents, like making call schedules and, you know, taking care of problems as they came up. Because a lot of my job as an administrator is doing psychological counseling. So it sort of started when I was a chief resident, and then at NYU, after the first 2 years, Herman Turndorf asked if I would be the director of anesthesia at Bellevue, which was a very challenging opportunity. And one of the reasons why I decided to do that was because that's where the neurosurgical cases, we had the largest number, and we had this neurosurgical intensive care unit where I could actually do my research. So, you know, it gave me a great opportunity with freedom as being director and not having to do all the cases myself as other attending would have to. So I had the ability to do the research, be the director, and found it interesting. Now, Herman was a really great administrator, so I could go to him for advice and mentorship, and he helped me a lot. So I learned a lot from that experience of about 3 years as director at Bellevue. And then when I decided to take the chair at Downstate, there were a number of opportunities at Harvard in the business school, and they offered courses in financial management, administrative management, psychological support for your administrative position, a variety of things. So I took those courses. And then the American Association of Medical Colleges also offered some courses. So over the years, I've learned a lot from those courses. You know, it really wasn't by chance in terms of spreadsheets and financial management and, you know, what's legal and what isn't legal in terms of billing and collection and those sorts of things. So it's been an interesting journey.
And you've hired a number of vice chairs in your department. How many do you have?
Correct. Well, you know, one of the things as I said earlier, I learned early on is that you really have to get people that are better than you are in certain areas. And so, you know, I decided we needed a vice chair for education, someone who knew a lot about education. And our current vice chair is just terrific, and Audrey Bindo, and she served on the Residency Review Committee, which oversees all the programs in the States, so she knows She knows all the rules and regulations. Our Vice Chair of Research is Rebecca Tversky, and she has spearheaded our residency training research program. All of our residents now have a research project, and we have grant funding, and it's just an incredible section in our department. And then we also have a Vice Chair for Clinical Affairs, and David Willody. He's also the chief at our affiliate, Long Island College Hospital, and he takes care of all the outside regulations so that we're compliant with Medicare and a variety of those things. And then we have another Vice Chair of Operations. And so the Vice Chair of Operations, since we cover 4 sites, we have a lot of scheduling to do. We have a lot of call schedules. We have a lot of planning for ambulatory surgery, for endoscopy. So he sort of runs those sections. So all of these people really contribute to the success of our department. And we also have a Director of Medical Student Education. So she, and Dr. Connie Hill, and she does our medical student program, which is ranked by the medical students as one of the top clinical rotations. We only share that with clinical medicine. So it's quite a feat for our education program for medical students.
So let's talk about the ASA. And in I think it was between 2002 and 2003, was it, that you were president?
Yes.
But there was a path towards that presidency.
Yes.
If you would talk about that and how you got there.
You know, actually it's a lifetime of work, and it probably started when I was at NYU, and I was very active with the New York State Society of Anesthesiologists. And there I was mainly involved in the scientific programs for the New York State, and eventually ran all the programs, the annual meetings, and the research section, the residence section, and a variety of things there. In addition, at ASA, as I told you, I was involved early on in the early 70s, or 76, 79, and I was trying to get some recognition for the subspecialties and to allow them to develop within ASA. So at the time, I also was active in the annual program committees, the scientific papers section, the refresher course lectures, became chair of a number of committees within the ASA, and which eventually led to my becoming the vice president for scientific affairs. So at the time, I was only interested in the science of our specialty, and in terms of organized medicine. And I really had not a lot of interest in being a political figure within our specialty, but I wanted to be known more for the scientific emphasis of our specialty and the advancement. So when I actually ran for office, I had no plans to run for higher office, because the scientific vice president for scientific affairs is sort of the highest you could go within the scientific realm of ASA. And then after 2 years, people came to me and said, I really think your emphasis on science could help if you became president, because then you could have an influence across the policies and procedures of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. So I started to think, what would I really like to do if I became president of the ASA? And so I just reviewed what I had done on different committees and the things I had tried to accomplish, and sort of listed the things that I wasn't able to do, because it took political clout to get things through. So after a lot of soul searching, I decided to run. And the New York State Society, being the biggest society, decided that I would be their candidate. So they also got behind and pushed me for this office. And every time I ran for office, I was challenged. It was many of the officers aren't challenged, so they go up unopposed and they win and they proceed right up to president or past president. So I had some very interesting and lively discussions with the opposition. So it was really quite fun to learn all that. But I did focus mostly on the scientific advancement of the specialty, but of course I had to get involved in the politics of the day. And the biggest political football was the practice of anesthesia scope, and that means the nurses being allowed to practice without physician supervision. So our National Society and the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists had a long battle about scope of practice. And the year that I ran, we had spent close to $4 million fighting this with lobbying and government agencies and things like that. And I thought, my gosh, if we had $4 million to spend on a scientific or educational endeavor, think what we could do. So then I started to emphasize the things I wanted to do on a national level. And I was able to convince the American Society of Anesthesiologists that we should go for more money for academic anesthesiology from Medicare. Some years ago, they had taken a lot of money away from us for supervision of residents. So I got the ASA to declare that as their #1 priority. The teaching rule, it was called, so that we would get more funding into academic training programs. And it's the first time we'd had an endeavor like this. It was the #1 priority. And now each department gets $400,000 to $500,000 more a year because of this reimbursement. So it was a major coup. So I was very pleased with that. Other things, again, I wanted to focus on the subspecialties. And so the annual meeting it's a great annual meeting. I always enjoyed it, but it was a bit disorganized. So I got a committee together and said, let's reorganize the committee based on subspecialty tracks so that the people working in the area arranged that part of the meeting. And it's been a huge success. Now all the subspecialty tracks are represented. If you're a neuroanesthesiologist, you can go to the meeting, and then at the 5-day meeting for 2 days you can focus only on neuro or cardiac or obstetrics. Also, I wanted to have other kinds of lecturers, not just medical or scientists. I thought we should have politicians, we should have movie stars, we should have a variety of people to come to our meeting and give interesting talks. So that was initiated as well. Also, there was...
May I ask who some of these movie stars and politicians were that you brought to the meeting?
Oh gosh, I didn't bring them. I introduced this concept and then they came later. Actually, they focus mainly on Nobel Prize winners. We've had a couple of Nobel Prize winners. And then last year, they had Tucker, somebody from NBC or ABC, Tucker Carlson. I can't remember who that. Anyhow, so they had that, and they've had, actually when I was president, I brought Hillary Clinton to talk to the legislative group, and there was a lot of concern because, you know, most anesthesiologists and doctors are Republican, so no one really wanted Hillary Clinton. So the opposition, as it were, said, well, if you're going to have Hillary Clinton, we want Libby Dole. So they invited her, and then Hillary and she had this disagreement that they couldn't speak back to back. So we went through this whole thing not only with the society, but with the two invited speakers. But it was great because Hillary spoke for 45 minutes without a note. She answered questions for another 45 minutes, and everyone came out of the room saying, she's not a monster. So I felt that as a big success. So that's the kind of speaker that I thought we should have, not only politics, but Nobel Prize winners and other specialties and a variety of people that would expand our interests. I also started a thing called the Celebration of Research. And it was a plenary session that I arranged, and it included the editor of Anesthesiology, the journal, would be the moderator for the panel. And then we would take the resident research winners and have them tell us a little bit about their research. There's a senior research scientist that receives an award, so we have them coming to tell the audience about how they developed into a senior scientist and have been so successful. And then I started a mid-career presidential scholarship.
Before you move on, isn't that also the plenary session that's famous for something else?
Yes,
okay.
But I don't want to go down in history as the kosher hot dog president.
But a number of these emails mentioned it.
Right. The other thing I thought is that being from New York and being that a lot of people come so that they can have lunch to different meetings. So I thought rather than have these horrible box lunches and sandwiches or whatever they have, that we would get these hot dog stands, kosher hot dog stands, and then Coke and things like that and potato chips, and have people pick those up on their way into the session. And it was wildly successful. I mean, we had, the room was just totally packed. And it's really the first time we've focused on research and have it be so successful. So it was really terrific. And then the other thing was I introduced this presidential scholar. And so it was for someone who was mid-career who had developed up to a point but was hoping to become a research scientist. So you could encourage those people to continue to pursue their dream. And so now each year we give a Presidential Scholar Award. The first one that I selected was Peter Pronovost, and he's the anesthesiologist at Hopkins who's been in all the news about decreasing intensive care infections and site infections, and he's been wildly successful. So it was a good choice. But each year there's someone equally as successful mid-career.
A number of people who I heard from talked about the importance of the reorganization of the national meeting. One even said you smashed the barnacles off the annual meeting. It sounds that scientific research, which was the direction that brought you there, was the emphasis that you were bringing.
I think it was simply a renewal of interest. I think we had forgotten about our original mission, and that's research as the basis for our medical specialty. And I think we had gotten so involved with the politics of scope of practice, with the politics of this, the politics of that, that we forgot that we're really medical doctors based on research and science. So if we could renew our commitment to that, it would be very important for our organization going forward. And I think the things I did will hopefully keep the focus on science as we go forward. But there are very few, I think, presidents of the ASA. There are more and more now who are actually academic physicians and faculty members. So it's important that there's something that continues the basis for our medical specialty within our national society.
Yeah, now when you were talking about creating plenary sessions, and there is one with non-anesthesiologists but also medical people. You spoke to me about translational research. Now, is that a special plenary apart from the ones you just spoke about?
There are a number of panels that address translational research now that go from the basic scientists who are not anesthesiologists but sort of focus on the basic mechanisms of anesthesia and anesthetic problems. Basic scientists like we have in our department. Ira Cass is a neurophysiologist. John Hartung is associate editor of the journal and works in our primate lab. So the basic science part then goes into translational research. You know, when you do research, it's so difficult and takes so long for something to be realized that can be used in humans. We started to do research studies in the late 70s, early 80s, so we would start with brain slices from animals, and then we would go to whole animals, whole rats, and then from there we'd have to go to primates And then you go to preliminary clinical trials. And to get that process completed, we just had one drug that can be used, and it's taken 30 years to get it to that point. So research is slow, and that's why we always have to remember it's the basis. Because if we don't focus on it for a year or 2 years, I mean, look how far we're behind in terms of advances.
There's another point that's not about science, but more about the political, administrative aspect of things that you didn't mention but I know about from earlier conversations, and that's the expert witness testimony aspect. So talk about what you did with that.
Well, actually, this wasn't my idea, but I had gone to an AMA meeting. I think one of the other privileges of being ASA president or vice president or first vice president is that you have a lot of contact with the other specialties. So you have interaction. So you go to meetings with the obstetricians, the pediatricians, the internists. And so one day I was at a meeting of the obstetricians, and they were talking about the new program that they had implemented called Irresponsible Expert Witness Program. And this is where the plaintiff gets an anesthesiologist as an expert to say that the anesthesiologist that anesthetized the plaintiff had made a mistake and had resulted in injury to the patient. Well, many people become expert witnesses to make money. So, that's all they do is they testify at these trials, and many of them have become very, very successful. So, and in fact, they're so successful that they forget the facts. They forget, the research basis for the practice. They forget the standard of practice. So a lot of these cases are won by irresponsible testimony, which is not factual. So we then initiated the program at ASA, and I just served on a committee where it's alleged by an anesthesiologist who was sued by a plaintiff that the facts were not accurate. And so if we find the facts are not accurate, then we can censor, or we can actually revoke the privileges of membership in the National Society. And so this really impairs their ability to continue as an expert witness, because someone can say, well, I understand that you've been censored by your National Society. So I think it's been very, very important for us. And Roger Litweiler sort of took that ball and went with it. He was the president after myself.
When we were talking about the future before, we did talk about training people in the third world, and it's not always possible to have physicians to do the anesthesia. And I wonder if you just talk about, just the global issues.
Right. I think we're very lucky in Western countries to have anesthesiologists, because if you go to many of the African countries, China, a variety of countries, they really don't have anesthesiologists. So the American Society of Anesthesiology has taken as one of its goals is to educate people in third world countries to be able to provide anesthesia, not necessarily physicians. So these people are able to provide anesthesia in certain areas. And I think it's very important going forward that we focus on that program, because I can think of nothing better to improve the health and well-being of third world countries if they had good surgical and anesthesia care, particularly for deliveries and a variety of pediatric cases, a variety of areas, because those are very complicated, complex cases.
Is there anything we haven't talked about during your tenure as president and all the steps towards it?
Well, I think, the biggest thing was the relationships I formed with the people during that period of time. It was such a wonderful group of people that I had the privilege to work with. The other officers and their wives, and when Joe came along, everyone was so friendly, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere that we had during the time I was on the executive committee and administrative council. So I think the relationships and the friendships I formed I'll remember forever.
Mm-hmm. In 2008, you were invited to give the Rovenstein Lecture.
Yes.
Would you talk about that?
Well, this is the lecture for anesthesiologists at our annual meeting, and it's quite an honor to be chosen to give it. And so one of the areas that I've been working on recently is cognitive function after anesthesia and surgery. And so the evidence for brain damage after anesthesia in children and older adults has been around since the 50s, and we've sort of ignored it. So I decided to focus on it, re-emphasize it, and challenge the membership to pursue this area. Because, you know, it's easy to say if someone dies from anesthesia or has a stroke or has a major morbidity, but it's harder if someone's had open heart surgery and 2 years later they have no cognitive function, because we're not really looking at that. You know, they're home or they're in a nursing home or something like that. So my challenge to the membership was we should pursue that. And actually, since that time, it's been a huge focus on cognitive abnormalities. And I was just in Italy speaking at an Italian meeting, and a young faculty member from Harvard, Saul Soriano, came up to me, and he's one of the researchers in the pediatric group that looks at cognitive function or behavioral abnormalities after anesthesia and surgery in kids. And he came up to me and he said, "I can't believe how important your lecture was, because before your lecture I had trouble getting my articles published. They were all rejected." He said, "Now I never have trouble getting my articles published about this problem." So I think, you know, it was a real opportunity for myself as well as the society to focus on this, because it's so important.
He actually wrote an email in which he said, and I took this down as a note, that as the ASA president, Dr. Cottrell was the most influential advocate to research neurosciences. His Rovenstein lecture elevated the status of neuroscience and anesthesiology. And so he wrote that to me too.
Well, he's doing just incredible work with pediatric patients at Harvard. He's really trying to sort out the problems with the developmental delays and behavioral abnormalities after anesthesia and surgery. So hopefully in the near future we'll have something.
You've really become an ambassador for the field internationally. I'd just like you to talk a little bit about what that means to you and why it's important.
Right. Well, I think if we go back to my earlier remarks about young people and encouraging them to do research in science, not only in the States, but also as I went to other countries. So it was a big opportunity to be invited to these different countries to talk about my research and talk about the books, talk about the journal. And so I met these incredible people who over the years have advanced in their specialties so that they can be trendsetters and people who sort of shape their specialties. Some of them came to train in our lab, and others simply by our relationship developed more in terms of the neurosciences. When I think for the European Society of Anesthesiologists, I befriended Hugo van Aken, and he too was a young guy, and over the years he invited me to speak at a variety of places, and then he used me as a consultant to shape the European Society of Anesthesiologists. There were 3 different societies that they were trying to combine into one. So it was quite an honor to be asked to make recommendations about how a new society would work and that sort of thing. And so I was made an honorary member of the European Academy of Anesthesia, and then subsequently an honorary member of the European Society of Anesthesiologists. And it was largely through my relationship with Hugo very early on in the 80s that came about. And I was lucky to be a good judge of character and someone who would be successful and concerned about the same things that I had been concerned about.
And you are also an honorary member of other societies in Europe.
Yes. Well,
which are, Will?
Great Britain, Germany, Belgium, so a variety of organizations have honored me in that regard.
I want to bring up the Handbook of Neuroanesthesia. And one of the emails I received said, thoroughly updated for its 4th edition, the Handbook of Neuroanesthesia is a review of the many aspects of perioperative management of the neurosurgery patient in an effective, easy-to-read outline format. Now this book has been translated into Chinese and is read by more anesthesiologists throughout China. And this is from Xi from Yijing City in China.
Mm-hmm. The large textbook is essentially a textbook that focuses on the basic sciences and some of the theories and development of the neurosciences. So it's a very thick book, and it's hard to carry around, and it's not an easy access book for clinical care. So I was at Grossinger's. There was a meeting there of the New York State Society of Anesthesiologists, and Philippa Newfield was there, and she was at UC San Francisco. And so we started talking about the need for a clinical guide to the practice of neuroanesthesia. And so this is a small book that you can put in your pocket, and if you're in the operating room, you can say, oh, I've just had an air embolus in this particular patient. What do I do now? Not that they would know, but in case they didn't, they could pull out this handbook and go right to 1, 2, 3. So the handbook is more of a cookbook of clinical procedure when problems occur and how to do it. So it's a how to do it book. And it's it too has been widely successful. I think we sell close to 10,000 copies a year or something like that.
And in how many languages is it translated? Do you know?
I think it's in Spanish, it's in Chinese, Japanese. I don't, maybe either French or Italian. I'm not sure which one. So, and the 5th edition we're working on now. So it should be out in September. So.
And you've also published a book that's for the layperson.
Yes. It's called Under the Mask. And I think this resulted from my clinical experiences. When I would go to the operating room and see patients preoperatively, many of them would say, just put me out, I don't want to know anything. So I thought, that's not the right attitude if you're going to be empowered to control your destiny. And anesthesiology and surgery are 2 very stressful things if you have to have them. So I thought there's so many things that patients should know in order to deal with this period. And so this was a book written for the lay people, and it went through the common surgical procedures, the possible problems with those procedures, how you potentially could avoid them, what you really need to tell the anesthesiologist in advance. If you have hypertension, if you have heart disease, I mean, the anesthesiologist needs to know that. And there may be a different anesthetic than a general anesthetic, so you may need a regional. So I used actual case histories and used some celebrity cases and those sorts of things to sort of illustrate the points. So it's really for the lay person who comes for anesthesia. I think it's done a good job, because people do now come to the operating room and say, I want a pediatric anesthesiologist. I want an epidural for my delivery. I want, So they do now know something about anesthesia if they've read this book. Yeah,
people didn't used to even think of anesthesia when they were going for surgery.
Right.
It was just surgery they thought about. And
and just a simple thing like pain control post-operatively. People really don't know their options. So if you know that you can have a button to push to control your pain, who wouldn't choose that? But most people don't know.
Mm-hmm. And there are other ways in which you've improved public awareness. And would you talk about what some of those things are, and why have you taken on that task?
I think it goes along with the book to empower people. And one of the things I've learned from Joe since he's in film and television is not to be afraid to talk to an interviewer from a news station. So as a result, as I achieved more of a reputation in certain areas, I would get calls from like the Today Show or one of those shows to ask me to talk about awareness. You know, do you have to be afraid that you're going to be awake during your anesthetic and surgery? So, you know, it's important for people to know that sometimes these things are unavoidable in order to save your life. So those were the kinds of things I wanted to get across. What you could do to avoid it, and then if you can't avoid it, you know, it's just the way it is. You know, you're alive. You're alive. So.
There is something else that we haven't talked about that you did, I think, after you came to Downstate, and that's the insurance that you provided for academic physicians.
Yes.
Could you talk about that?
Yes. In the 80s, there was a medical liability crisis. So, as you know, the medical liability market is generally to make money. People make money from selling medical liability insurance, and they bet that, you know, the losses aren't going to be as great as the premiums and a variety of things. So we had a crisis in the state of New York where many of the insurance companies were leaving. And so as an academic institution, SUNY, State University of New York, it was hard for us to afford insurance and to obtain insurance. So 3 of us got together to decide to talk about what we thought we could do in terms of obtaining insurance consistently. And we met another friend who was working with an insurance company, and we thought that because we're academic faculty that our risk would be less, the severity of the injury would be less, so our malpractice claims would be less. And so we thought, this is a good idea if we could start an insurance company that insures only academic faculty, or people who teach, people who do research, people who are at the cutting edge of medicine. So we struggled for a couple of years trying to get reinsurance that would help us form the company and raising capital. But eventually we got it all together, and now it's been 20 years. It's been a very successful insurance company, and we only insure academic faculty. And as we expected, the claims are fewer, the severity and the amount of the cost for the claims is less for academic physicians. So it really has been great, and it's been a big help to the faculty of SUNY medical schools, the 4 of them in New York. And we also insure New York Medical College. So.
What's the name of their insurance company?
It's called Academic Health Professionals Insurance Association, APIA.
And is that something that has been a model for other states?
You know, actually it hasn't. Other states are interested in us, and other people are interested in us for obvious reasons, but we're trying to keep it to ourselves. And no one has really started another insurance company like it as yet.
Apart from that, you've also done volunteer work having to do with AIDS. And I'd like you just to talk about not only AIDS, but the other volunteer work that you've done.
Well, I think in the early 80s, as you know, there was an AIDS epidemic that was wiping out, you know, our friends and the community, a lot of the community in New York. And it was a time of fear and discrimination and those sorts of things. So I guess the first work I did was in 1987. I took a sabbatical to work with Senator Kennedy. And during that time, I was lucky enough to work with David Nixon and Mona Sarfati. And so we got together and said we should write an AIDS non-discrimination bill. You know, because people would go to hospitals, they weren't allowed to have visitors that were, you know, lovers, and they weren't, you know, they wouldn't bring the food into the room because they were afraid of contamination. They wouldn't accept certain patients at certain facilities So I was able with them to write this AIDS non-discrimination bill that was ultimately passed. So that was really great. And then in New York, there was an organization called God's Love We Deliver, and feeding homebound patients with AIDS. So we would cook the meals and have them delivered and walk upstairs. And it was, I think it was comforting to these people to get good meals and to be able to stay at home and eat. Then while I was in Washington, I became friends with people who were with AIDS Action Council. And it was a council that sort of supported AIDS issues and non-discrimination and a variety of things. And so then we thought we needed to be able to raise money like a profit wing. So we formed AIDS Action Foundation, and I was the first chair of that. And we advocated on behalf of people with AIDS and really tried to change the attitude of the public to people suffering with AIDS. Doctors of the World was another organization that I worked with, but it really had nothing to do with AIDS, but it went for disasters in various parts of the world and to support the people during times of crisis.
And apart from that, you have a very deep interest in contemporary art.
Yes. You know, to get back to the AIDS work as well, my partner Joe, as I said, is a TV producer, and he also was very active in this area, and I think some of that influence also rubbed off on me. He was able to produce the first TV story with Barbara Walters holding a baby with AIDS, so that helped a lot. So then the art collection. We were in New York, and Joe met a friend named Sue Williams, and she was a producer, and they became good friends. And her husband was Roland Flexner, and he was an artist. And so we became good friends. So when we would travel or when we would go to dinner, Sue and Joe would talk about film, and Roland would take me to visit artists, and we would talk about art. And you know, artists in those days, this was the 80s, always needed money. So we were lucky enough to have a little bit of money. So we were, you know, we could buy some work. And all of a sudden, I guess it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago we decided to renovate our house. And a friend of ours was a curator at a museum. And so she was having dinner, and she said, "What are you going to do with the art when you renovate your house?" And I said, "Well, we're going to put it in storage with the rest of the stuff we have." And she says, "Oh my goodness, I think we could get some museums to show your collection." So that was sort of the first time I think I recognized that we were collectors. And so then she did the first catalog and had the first show at a major museum in Florida. And then it sort of traveled around 5 or 6 different museums. And it's been really fun because what we've done with the art collection, it's like collect people. Like I collected anesthesiologists, I now collect artists. So I meet artists at shows and meet artists through friends or at museums and curators. And if I think they're really exciting and dedicated to the process, then I try to follow them for as long as I can, both with buying their work and supporting their work in other areas, like making donations to museums of their work and stuff like that.
And you have a wonderful art collection. I can attest to that.
Thank you.
So, in conclusion, what are some of the most important things that you feel you've done, and what do you hope will happen in the near future? And what do you think of as your legacy? So let's start with, you know, really what you're most proud of.
Well, I think at this point in my career, when I look back, the most important thing has been being able to recognize talent and encourage them and collect them. It's been truly amazing, the people that I've known and the people that have supported the same endeavors and desires that I've had. I think our biggest accomplishments have been to contribute to better outcomes for these patients during anesthesia and surgery by not only becoming role models, but also being equal members of the team. And in fact, sometimes the trendsetters in the team, as we've seen in a variety of areas. I think that's probably what I think is my greatest talent, is the recognition of those people and being able to be friends with them.
And nurture them.
And nurture them. Mm. And they me. And I think, going forward in the future, we continue to pursue the cognitive function studies with primate studies. We're working with other departments at Downstate, and there's some very exciting work going on with short-term and long-term memory. And we're trying to create a model for amnesia so that we don't have to use drugs to cause amnesia, which can have dangerous side effects. So the future's very exciting in terms of what the possibilities are. It's been a terrific journey, and one that I've really enjoyed and don't think I would have done it any other way. Really pleased.